My parents chose my troubled brother over me to run the family business. Now he's in jail for money laundering and the company is falling apart. About 2 months ago, my parents dropped a bombshell on me. They decided to ask their precious firstborn son to take over the family business I'd spent the last few years helping them build. That was the moment I knew I had to walk away, not just from the business, but from my family altogether. It was insane to me, considering my brother wasn't exactly the kind of person you'd call dependable. Actually, he wasn't a good guy at all. And by that, I don't just mean he was occasionally mean or unfair, I mean he was a full-blown criminal. The thing is, my parents knew this. They weren't clueless. But for them, it didn't matter. He was their eldest son, and nothing was going to change the fact that they'd keep coddling him forever. For context, I'm 26, and my brother is 30. Even as kids, he was the type to lie, cheat, and steal like it was second nature. And it's not like he was even good at it. He got caught all the time. But instead of dealing with it properly, my parents would just scold him a little, maybe ground him for a few days, and then smooth everything over for him. He learned quickly that as long as he could charm them, he could get away with just about anything. Of course, that charm didn't work on me. I saw through him from the start, and I didn't like what I saw. That's probably why we had such a rocky relationship growing up. I thought he was a straight-up bad person, and I didn't bother trying to bond with him. My parents, on the other hand, thought I was being judgmental and stuck up, so they'd insist we spend time together, which we both hated. Eventually, we each went our separate ways for our careers and only saw each other during the holidays. Then, a few months after I finished high school, my parents told me my brother had been fired from his job for fraud and was under investigation. Honestly, I wasn't even a little surprised. He'd been heading down that road for years, and even as a teenager, he'd been a bit of a delinquent. For a while, he went on the run, but somehow, he managed to get the charges dropped, probably with a lot of help and money from my parents. Once again, everything was smoothed over. That was about 3 or 4 years ago. After they bailed him out, my parents made a big show of cutting ties with him, saying they were doing it to teach him a lesson. I remember thinking it was about time they did something right. Around that same time, my dad asked me to work with him in the family business. I just graduated and was job hunting anyway, so I figured there was nothing better than working with my family. I agreed, and from that point on, I put my all into helping my parents run the business. I learned everything I could, knowing that someday I'd take over. My dad wasn't anywhere close to retiring yet, so it wasn't something we talked about much, but I just assumed that when the time came, the business would naturally pass to me. After all, my brother was out of the picture, or so I thought. About 6 months ago, my brother reappeared, claiming he'd turned over a new leaf. He told my parents he wanted to apologize for everything he'd done and begged for a second chance. He said he'd been working an honest job for the past few years and wanted to prove he'd changed. He even said he'd stay out of their lives if they didn't want him around. Personally, I thought they should have told him to stay gone. But, of course, my parents softened and decided to forgive him. They told me everyone deserves a second chance, and that shut me up. I didn't want to argue and cause trouble, especially since I was working closely with them on the business. Plus, as long as he stayed away from the business, I figured I could live with it. I didn't live at home anymore, so I wouldn't have to deal with him much anyway. When he moved back, my parents were overjoyed, and honestly, he seemed happy too. They even threw a little family reunion to celebrate. At first, he acted like a changed man, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My gut told me not to trust him, but I kept quiet. Things seemed fine, and I didn't want to be the bad guy. A couple of months went by, and my brother and I had little to no interaction. But I couldn't help wondering why he was still living with our parents. After working for years, he should have had enough money to live on his own. He claimed he'd missed them and wanted to make up for lost time, but I wasn't buying it. Still, my parents thought I was being paranoid and told me to back off, so I did. Then, 2 months ago, my dad dropped the news that sent me reeling. He'd started training my brother to take over the business. My dad explained that he planned to retire soon, and once my brother finished his training, he'd take over completely. I couldn't believe it. After everything, I'd assumed the business would eventually pass to me. It only seemed fair. But my dad told me that since my brother was the eldest, he was first in line. That's when it all clicked, and I realized just how much I'd been blindsided. It didn't matter to my parents that my brother had never lifted a finger to help with the family business, unlike me. He hadn't shown the slightest interest, even when they tried to involve him right after he graduated. That day, I got into a heated argument with my dad, hoping that maybe my mom would see my side of things. But when I talked to her, I realized she was fully on board with him taking over too. I tried reasoning with them, pointing out how reckless it was to hand the business to someone who had literally been accused of fraud and who they themselves had to bail out. But they brushed it off, saying that everyone makes mistakes, and as their son, he deserved their forgiveness. To appease me, they floated the idea of us running the business together as partners. That was laughable. There was no way I could work alongside my brother. We were like oil and water, and it would never work. So I laid it out for them plainly: if he was going to be involved in the business, I was out. The way I saw it, it was already bad enough having to deal with him as family. There was no way I'd tolerate him in my workplace too. We went back and forth, arguing endlessly, but in the end, my parents chose his side. That was the final straw for me. I felt like a complete fool for putting years of effort into the business, only to have it ripped out from under me. So I decided to cut my losses, walk away from the family, and focus on my own future. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been job hunting, though I haven't been stressing over it much. I saved up enough from working in the business to hold me over for a while. Still, the whole situation left me feeling bitter, thinking about how my brother was about to inherit everything I'd worked so hard for while my parents turned a blind eye to common sense. I even toyed with the idea of taking legal action against them. I'd poured years of my life into that business, and it didn't seem fair for them to just toss me aside. But then again, nothing had been finalized yet. At the end of the day, it was my dad's business, and he had every right to do whatever he wanted with it. I was stuck, unsure of what my next move should be. As it turns out, I didn't have to do a thing. Karma decided to handle it for me. A few days ago, my brother made the news. And, as you can probably guess, it wasn't for anything good. Just 2 months after my parents started preparing to hand over the business to him, he got exposed as a criminal. No surprise there. I'd had a gut feeling all along, but my parents had refused to listen, and now the truth was out. Apparently, the company he'd worked for before was nothing more than a front for money laundering. On top of that, there were several other charges tied to him and a group of accomplices. The entire operation had been busted, and while my brother hadn't been involved with them for the last couple of months, they still named him as part of the scheme. Now he's neck-deep in legal trouble. This is all I know for now, but ever since the news broke, my phone has been blowing up. Friends, family, everyone's been reaching out. And, of course, my parents have been trying desperately to get in touch with me too. For the past 2 months, they hadn't bothered to speak to me at all after I walked away from the business. But now, suddenly, they can't stop calling. At first, I ignored their calls. I needed a break from their nonsense. But this morning, I decided to finally call them back. I figured they'd probably be falling over themselves to apologize and beg me to come back. But nope, true to form, my parents started off completely wrong. The first thing they did was talk about my brother and how much trouble he was in. Apparently, the cops are knee-deep in their investigation, and he's being held in custody while they sort everything out. Because of his prior offenses, things aren't looking good for him. He's denying all of it, of course, claiming he had nothing to do with the money laundering and even saying he'd lost money trying to get away from those people. Turns out, I was right all along. He was broke. That's why he'd been living with my parents instead of getting his own place. The whole situation just confirmed everything I'd been saying from the start. When I finally called my parents back, I wasn't expecting much, but I still couldn't believe what I heard. Instead of starting with an apology, they jumped straight into how terrible the situation was, not just for my brother, but for the whole family. They practically begged me to help them out, claiming I needed to step in and do something to fix this mess. I couldn't help it. I laughed right in their faces. The entitlement, the nerve, the absolute lack of accountability. I told them outright that the only people I'd be helping were the authorities. Why? Because I had been right all along. They never listened when I tried to warn them, and they chose to put their faith in my brother, despite his shady past. They had made their bed, and now it was time to lie in it. They were shocked, offended, even by my response. They started throwing words like unfair and family at me, saying I needed to think about the bigger picture and our family's reputation. They even had the audacity to play the business card, warning me that the family business might be investigated because of how closely my brother had been working with them these past 2 months. For the sake of the business, they said, I had to help. I wasn't having any of it. I reminded them that they'd made it perfectly clear where their priorities lay when they pushed me aside in favor of my brother. Even now, they were choosing to believe his claims of innocence, despite his history, despite the overwhelming evidence, despite common sense. Who else but my parents would stand by a guy like him? Certainly not me. They hadn't called me to apologize or admit they were wrong. No, they called to guilt-trip me into cleaning up a mess I didn't make. The sheer gall of it was infuriating. I didn't hold back, I let them know exactly how I felt. That's when they turned the tables, calling me selfish and accusing me of being too caught up in my grudge against my brother to see the bigger picture. The call ended on a sour note. They were angry, and honestly, so was I. But I stood firm. I wasn't going to help them, and I certainly wasn't going to help my brother. Update 1. I've decided to ignore my parents entirely and focus on myself. The truth is, I don't think they've ever really cared about me. For as long as I can remember, my brother has always been their priority. Those few years when he was out of touch with them? That was the only time they treated me like I mattered. And even then, I suspect it was just because they thought they had no other option for passing on the family business. Looking back, it's obvious that nothing has changed. The moment my brother came back into the picture, I was pushed to the sidelines again. They've never apologized for how they treated me, and now they're trying to make me the villain for refusing to help someone who's never been anything but toxic to me. Even if my brother had been decent to me since coming back, I might have considered helping. But he wasn't. We barely spoke, and our relationship remained as strained as ever. So why should I go out of my way for someone who has no real connection to me beyond blood? My parents calling me selfish is the height of irony. Isn't that exactly what they've been? They ignored my years of hard work, choosing instead to hand everything to my brother simply because he was their golden boy. If it hadn't been his age, they would have found some other excuse to justify their favoritism. But you know what? None of that matters anymore. I've decided to focus on building something of my own. I have the resources, I have the knowledge, and I'm confident I can create a successful business from scratch. I don't need them. For the first time in a long time, I feel free. To everyone who supported me, thank you. Your encouragement helped me stop doubting myself and see things clearly. Update 2. It's been a little over a week since I last spoke to my parents, and after that call, I blocked them. Now, they have no way to reach me, and I couldn't be happier. I have no idea what's going on with my brother, and frankly, I don't care. The police haven't contacted me yet, but I imagine they might when the case goes to trial. If they ask me to testify, I'll gladly do it against him. He deserves to face the consequences of his actions, and I won't stand in the way of justice. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm finally doing what's best for me. I'm no longer weighed down by my family's drama, and I'm ready to move forward with my life. Things are finally catching up with my brother, and for once, it seems like our parents can't just throw money at the problem to make it go away. Whatever he's done this time is serious, and frankly, it's about time he faced the consequences of his actions. He's dodged accountability for far too long. Personally, I'll be glad to see him pay the price. Of course, my parents are still in full damage control mode, doing everything they can to protect him. Before anyone else could approach me, they showed up at my house earlier today. I'd been spending the past few days at home, trying to decompress, so when I saw them standing outside, I refused to let them in. I didn't need to guess why they were there, I knew it wasn't to apologize, so I told them to leave. But my parents being my parents, they didn't budge. My dad finally spoke up, saying they'd come to bargain with me. That got my attention, so I let him explain. He told me they'd realized that appealing to my emotions and asking me to stand up for the family wasn't going to work since, according to him, I wasn't the sentimental type. Instead, he said they wanted to offer me money, whatever amount I wanted, as long as I promised not to testify against my brother. I was stunned. My own father was standing there, blatantly trying to buy me out. He even doubled down, saying that a brother testifying against another brother would reflect poorly on the family and that I needed to think about how bad it would look for all of us. It took me a moment to recover from the sheer audacity of it all. When I did, I told him in no uncertain terms that I wasn't accepting a dime from him and that he needed to leave before I called the cops. That's when my mother chimed in, screaming at me about how selfish I was and how disappointed she was in my behavior. She kept going on about how she didn't raise me to be this way, accusing me of being egotistical and self-centered. At that point, I'd had enough. I opened the door and stepped out to face them. I was livid, and I told them that if they thought I was selfish, they had no one to blame but themselves. I learned this behavior from them, after all. They'd always excused my brother's ego and terrible behavior, so why was it suddenly unacceptable when I acted the same way? I reminded them how they'd happily let me go 2 months ago without a second thought, all because my brother had returned. Back then, I wasn't family enough for them to keep me in the business. But now that their precious golden boy was in trouble, they expected me to act like we'd always been one big happy family? No, that's not how it works. I was so furious I ended up yelling at them, a rarity for me. I'm not the type to raise my voice, it's draining, and I prefer to keep my cool. But this time, I couldn't hold back. I screamed until my throat hurt, telling them to leave and never come back. If they did, I warned them, I wouldn't hesitate to call the cops. They must have finally realized I wasn't bluffing because they left. Whether they'll come back or not, I don't know, but if they do, I'm sticking to my word. I'm done with them. Today was emotionally exhausting, and while I got some closure, it wasn't worth the toll it took on me. I hate wasting my energy on people like them. Update 3. It's official, my brother's case is going to trial next week. I haven't spoken to my parents since that last encounter, and naturally, I've stayed out of the loop regarding my brother's situation. I don't care to know the details, either. Instead, I've been pouring all my energy into building a business model and looking for potential investors. I've got some savings to fall back on if I need to, but I'd prefer not to deplete them entirely. Things are starting to take shape, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally moving forward with my life. I've been sharing my business plan with one of my uncles. He's pretty well off, and I figured he'd be a great person to bring on board. During one of our conversations, he mentioned what he'd heard about my brother's case. It was surprising, but I didn't dig into it with him. By now, the entire family knows I'm no longer speaking to my parents, and it's sparked a chain reaction. People are choosing sides. Thankfully, my uncle, despite being my dad's brother, has taken mine. He's even stopped speaking to my dad after hearing how I've been treated. When I told him about my parents' attempt to buy me out so I wouldn't testify, he was shocked. Unfortunately, he mentioned it to his wife, and she spread the word like wildfire. Now the whole family knows about it. Even those who initially sided with my parents are raising eyebrows over the situation. They've started questioning why my parents would try to pay me off if my brother is innocent. It's the kind of move that screams guilt, and it's not going unnoticed. Since then, relatives have been reaching out, fishing for information about my parents, my brother, and the trial. But I've kept my lips sealed. I refuse to be part of the family grapevine or turn my situation into gossip fodder. I've made it clear that I'll only speak up when legally required, when I testify. To be honest, I'm not looking forward to that moment. I know it's going to be emotionally taxing, but I've made up my mind. I'm prepared for what's to come, and I'll face it when the time arrives. Update 4. Hey, everyone. It's been a while since my brother's trial, and last week, the verdict was finally announced, he's going to jail. Am I happy about it? Not really. This entire ordeal has been painful. But it was inevitable, and I can only hope my parents learn something from all this. From what I've heard through the grapevine, though, they're still in denial. They've been posting all over social media about how unfair his incarceration is, convinced he's innocent. It's frustrating because the court proved otherwise, but my brother seems to have brainwashed them beyond repair. Meanwhile, their blind loyalty to him has wreaked havoc on the family business. I've heard from relatives that they've been so consumed with fighting for my brother that they've neglected the company entirely. Employees are leaving, and the losses keep piling up. At this rate, they might have to shut the whole thing down. Looking back, I'm relieved I got out when I did. Otherwise, I'd be stuck in the middle of that mess. I haven't spoken to my parents since the day they tried to bribe me, but I did see them at the trial when I testified. As promised, I told the truth on the stand, and while they were visibly upset, they didn't confront me. Honestly, I wouldn't have cared if they had. Now that the dust has settled, the rest of the family has distanced themselves from my parents. They've been left to deal with the fallout on their own, but they only have themselves to blame. They can scream for justice online all they want, but justice has already been served. If they can't handle that, well, that's their problem. As for me, life's finally moving in the right direction. With funding from my uncle and a few of his friends, along with some of my own savings, I launched my business 2 months ago. It's still early days, and I know it'll take time before we really take off, but so far, things are going well. I'm incredibly proud of myself for making this dream a reality. Owning a business has been a goal of mine since I was a kid, and I'm determined to build it into something big. I'm still young, and I've got plenty of time to turn this into the empire I've always envisioned. Fingers crossed, I can't wait to see where this journey takes me.